All right, here we are live. If you are on the social media watching the podcast, or if you're listening, this is episode number 54 of the Trauma Informed Educators Network podcast. I just think about my first podcast with Jim Sporletter, where I just had a little computer. I didn't have this cool little space, and boy, how things have come along and how many people I've spoken to. And I am so excited about tonight's guest. Diane Gould is bringing a wealth of experience from social work. And get ready, people, because I'm about to say it, Bcba. And she's like, oh, please, Matthew, tell me that people aren't going to be. I said, no. I put on the little advertisement that the paradigm shift of a Bcba. So, Diane, how are you? And welcome to the podcast. And then, what is the Diane story? Tell us about you.
All right. Well, I'm so excited to be here. So thanks so much for having me. And you all, thanks for listening. So who am I? So when I was probably about 10, I read a book about Jane Addams, and I wanted to be Jane Addams when I grew up. I was probably the only 10-year-old who at Halloween wanted to trick or treat for UNICEF instead of candy. All my friends really thought I was out of my mind. And I knew somewhere there was a social work school, Jane Addams School of Social Work. I didn't live in Illinois, but I ended up going to Jane Addams School of Social Work in Illinois. I wound up focusing my practice on kind of the neurodiverse population. And that started because probably the first social worker I ever really met in person was a single mom who moved into my neighborhood when I was in high school. And she had two adopted daughters, and one was my age. And like a good social worker, to keep her daughters out of trouble, she for the summer when there wasn't school, she tried to get all the girls in the neighborhood together to do volunteer work. And she had us all volunteering at the Special Recreation Association. They still have those, even though this was a long time ago. And her daughters dropped out in a week, and the other girls dropped out in a couple of weeks. And I made it my career. So over the years after graduating from social work school, I've worked in agencies. I've worked for 2 special ed co-ops. We have those in Illinois as a to provide services to public schools. And now I just do private practice. I figured I'm not so good having bosses and following rules, so I work for myself now. So the first school I worked in was for kids who lived at a big residential facility outside of Chicago. It was based on Boys Town, that old movie. So this was kind of the Boys Town model. It was very behavioral and a very complicated point system that I don't know how the kids understood, because I didn't really understand it. And I know all the teachers there kind of thought I was soft, because I wasn't firm on the kids. But I did my share of restraining, because I think the rule was something like you can give a kid 3 instructions in a row, and if they don't follow it, you restrain them. Maybe I'm not remembering exactly, but it was something drastic. And now, so I was in my 20s then, I'm in my 60s now. I'm so horrified by it. And what's the most horrifying to me is that was the expectation. I did it with like blind obedience. And I just acted without questioning about it and reflecting on it. And people mistreating people blindly is such a part of our history, right? And we judge people for doing it, but it's so easy to fall into it. And I think about that all the time. So when I've worked in different schools, I always wanted to really help the kids who were struggling. Then I thought about it as struggling behaviorally, but really they were struggling emotionally. So I wasn't thrilled about the BCBAs I met or traditional approaches. So I went back to school to get my BCBA. I didn't really like how people talked about kids and their behavior. It didn't really make sense to me. So I went back to school, even though I was really old and it was hard to do. And at first, I tried to be a BCBA when I passed this horrible test. And, I tried to use the jargon, I attended conferences and tried to have fun, but it was always like wearing clothes that didn't fit. It just never felt okay for me. But luckily, I don't even know how it started, but I met a bunch of like nonprofit good guy lawyers who were helping kids in Chicago in due process cases, kids whose needs weren't being met, and these were kids with horrible trauma backgrounds, and the attorneys liked that I was a social worker who had my BCBA. They needed a BCBA for these lawsuits, but they wanted me to use that social work lens when I was helping these kids.
Isn't
And
that an oxymoron though?
I, well, for a while, the
Sorry.
BCBAs wouldn't let social workers become BCBAs. I think
Right.
they thought we liked families or kids too much. So, but
Yes.
then for some reason they let us back in. But even then, without really understanding brain science at that point, it just made sense to me that like kids needed to feel safe to learn, that they needed to feel heard and understood, they needed trusting relationships, and those kids were not going to benefit from rewards and consequences. They just weren't, these really complicated lives and these simplistic interventions. It just didn't make sense to me. And I like to have things make sense in my own head and very practical. And so I was kind of doing that work. And then uh, I became interested in PDA, which is this profile of autism that's recognized in New Zealand and Australia and the UK and not here, but it's an an anxiety based need for control for autistic individuals, and they demand avoidance as part of it. They resist the expectations and demands of everyday life. So I started working in that field and reading kind of what the books about PDA were, and the interventions were these kind of trauma informed strategies, and the things just that I had been recommending in these lawsuits for these kids. So I was really delighted to kind of help this population. And these were kids that were getting kicked out of school, that were secluded and restrained. And about 70% of PDAers don't attend school regularly around the world. And then I got active in the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint, and I feel like every week I'm getting a little more radical. And I've been studying the low arousal crisis intervention programs in the UK. I feel that everywhere else is doing things better than we are, even though I've talked to families all over the world and they're complaining, but I still
Mhm.
think they're better than we are. So I work with a lot of families now and autistic individuals. Feel so honored and privileged to be in their lives. I'm at the point thinking about giving up my BCBA because autistic adults have had so much trauma from ABA, even though I've never done ABA. They, are so against BCBA folks that I keep going back and forth every day about
Sure.
help or
Sure.
not.
And I think that those four letters in the trauma informed world, right, do give people like a little angst of like, wait, what do you mean? And
Absolutely.
I don't know if you're part of the Trauma Informed Educators Network group on Facebook, but man, there has been a lot of heated discussions around this, right? And I think that those discussions are necessary because it's time that we start having these discussions, because having heard from you in this first almost 10 minutes, I realize that those letters aren't define you, right? They don't
Mhm.
tell who you are. But let me go to,
Sure.
how did the paradigm shift? Where did that occur when you were formally trained in the BCBA processes? And for those of you who do not know what
Oh, yeah.
BCBA is, let's first start there, because we use a
Sure.
lot of letters in
I
education. Maybe
know.
there's people that aren't listening. What is a BCBA? And then tell us about how this shift occurred.
Sure. So BCBA is a Board Certified Behavior Analyst. So it's a postmaster's certificate on how to change behavior. And it's based on what we used to call behavior modification. When I was a psych major undergraduate, I had to train a rat to graduate to get my undergraduate in behavioral psych, and um, and it was kind of thought the same principles apply to humans. And again, another thing that I didn't question, and a lot of people don't question, but I think now I realize humans aren't rats or pigeons. But it was, it was all designed that
Sure.
reinforcement.
Yeah.
What comes after a behavior is going to strengthen it and make it more likely to happen, or it could be punished
Sure.
so it stops happening. And it sounds good and it works for me. And these principles can work in schools for the kids who don't need them.
Right. That's exactly right.
Right. But our problem is we use them for
On
the
everybody.
on everybody.
That's exactly right. It's interesting because I go back and I think about this. I think it was last year, maybe the year before. We had a child who was very escalated. I don't tell trauma stories, but I do want to tell one significant detail of this. We had a child that was very escalated. And the BCBA for our district just happened to be at the school. And so we had a conversation, and I had her observe. And I said, "So what do you think? What do you think it is?" She's like, "I think she's avoiding. I think she's trying to get out of something."
Right.
And I let her talk for a bit, and I go, "How about this? She literally got kicked out of her hotel last night."
Mhm.
Like, that wasn't even on
Right.
the radar. Like,
Right.
and then it was like, "Whoa, wait, what?" I'm like, "Well, let me tell you, the child literally got kicked out of the hotel last night.
Mm.
The only reason we knew that is because her mom had told us, right?" So
Right.
we were going. The suggestion, which we did not do, obviously, was to do a behavior modification, some sort of token economy to teach the child. And I'm like, but this, but, I mean, if I got kicked out of my house last night, right? Like, that isn't going to help me. But what's going to help me is saying, "I see you. It seems like you're having a hard
Right.
time. Let's go figure out what's going on. Hey, that is really tough. How
Right.
can we, and
Right.
that always sticks out to me, because
Sure.
automatically it was one of those four things: avoidance,
Right.
attention.
Right.
What's the other? I'm missing. There's three.
Tangible,
That's
like
it.
looking for tangibles.
Yeah.
Right. But the other thing is, to me, not only would that not help this child, it would cause them to further feel misunderstood. And that's what really concerns me for kids that are struggling. The other part is, even when there isn't as dramatic a story and we see a kid avoiding, traditional behavioral approaches don't ask the obvious and important question of why. Why would this child need to avoid? Because I'm sure it's a good reason. The work's too hard. There's something else on their mind. They're uncomfortable for some reason. They don't understand. Just, there's so many possibilities. But if we don't ask why and we don't do the work to understand it, we're not going to make things better. So that then the child's going to have to keep on avoiding. And sometimes what I've seen over the years, the kid avoids the task, and then they avoid the class, and then they avoid going to school. So if we don't help them, because if they could have fixed the problem, they would have.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really in our hands.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the
Mm-hmm.
same with the attention. So often it's thought of kids are trying to avoid something or get something, and often with the getting, it is attention. And it's the same thing in my head. Why would the child need our attention now? Is it a connection? Do they need to feel safe? Do they need a shoulder? Do they need understanding? They need something. So why would we not want to know what that is?
Right. And I think even being heard.
Right. Being
I mean,
heard.
I'm going to be honest. As a kid, I remember the agony of not feeling heard.
Right.
Man, at school, in life, so on and so forth, just letting kids be heard. I want to put up a question because I think this is a very interesting
Okay.
one that David Dooley, who is listening live to the podcast, said, in an effort to prevent trauma caused by unsupportive and harmful parenting, do you think there should be a new kind of parenting education that reaches everyone everywhere? Should the CDC or other public health organizations be working on this kind of parenting education, perhaps national multimedia messages that changes parenting behaviors and practices generally recognized as supporting healthy development of children? What do you think, Diane? I know I have some opinions on this because nobody taught me how to parent except for my parents, and now that's how they parented me.
Right. I don't think multimedia messages are going to be enough. I love the idea of parent training. I love the idea of it being normalized. So there's not a stigma. I think we'd have to be very careful on what that training looks like, because traditional parenting training is a behavioral response. There's parent training that includes timeouts and lots of punishment. So I'm not confident it would be good and I'd rather have, I don't know, probably no training than bad training, because I'm a pessimist. So I'm admitting that, I'm always worried things will go wrong.
Yeah.
But I would love it to be just part of life and education, just like any relationships.
Yeah.
Too. But there's such a stigma in our country for needing help, for talking about hard things, for even just parents just of newborns. Because I remember, like, at midnight or something at a grocery store, store aisle, probably getting something when I had a newborn, and running into people and thinking, like, can I really say I am miserable? Like when they're like, how's the baby? And I had,
Yeah.
I am so miserable. I think I'm losing my mind. But no,
Yeah.
you wouldn't say that. You'd be like, yeah, no, it's great. He's adorable. Like we're so much needs to happen.
Yeah.
And us being honest to get support and it being safe. And people are judgmental.
Yeah. And being honest and vulnerable. I think, vulnerability is a key. And I think as a principal and a parent, I tell parents, the parents at my school all the time, I take my principal hat off and I'm like, listen, I can handle 325 other people's children.
Right.
But there are days that my single 10-year-old pushes me to the brink of losing it. And I'm like, it is because I know he knows better, blah, blah, blah. But then I got to pause and go, hold on a minute. He's only 10. Like, I have to teach. I have to make sure I'm staying in that same space and presence for him. I know we have another listener that just had a great suggestion. Yeah. Dr. Mona Delahook, who was on this podcast several episodes ago, has a new book coming out called Brain Body Parenting. True.
And I'm sure it's fabulous.
And I bet it is going to be remarkable. So for David, that might be something you even want to look into, spread the news about, because I think it is important. Brain body parenting, not behavioral parenting. We're not fixing behavior. We're building brains and understanding the impact of the nervous system in the body. So let's get into this.
Can I say one thing?
Yeah, please.
With the philosophy, which most of us like-minded folks share, of kids do well if they can. It's also parents. Parents do well if they can.
Fact.
And parents need jobs. And they need enough money to not worry about, where the next meal is coming. They need all their needs met to be able to be present and give to their children, to be able to benefit from a parenting class too. So I think there's just so many
Layers.
to it.
And I agree. And, you know, Jim Spoiler, like I mentioned earlier, he was
Mhm.
the first guest on this podcast. It's been, I don't know, a year or something ago. And he said that one thing he regretted as a principal is he didn't use the same practices towards the parents as he did the kids.
Yeah.
And I have really thought about that when I'm engaging with a parent, that I have to use the same tools. I have to use the same empathetic responses. I have to make sure that I'm listening, to seek first to understand, then to be understood.
Right.
It is the same process. Not that there's anything wrong with the parents.
No.
It's simply the same. I get upset sometimes at my child's school. I think we talked about that before we got on here. You know, I hope they approach me in the same way that I would approach another parent.
Right, too. And like you said earlier, Matthew, at the end of the day, people just want to be heard. And parents are the same.
It's a
They
fact.
need to be, they need to be heard.
So let's dig into this.
Okay.
So I really want to know your perspective of the traditional behaviorist structures that schools have. And I want to hear about like what you traditionally see. And then I want to talk about what are the new ideas when you say like, because you shifted those 3 or 4 reasons kids have behaviors to like seeking connection, needing that that connection verbally or whatever. I want to hear those differences. And then I want to get into what do schools do to begin to shift the paradigm of going from the behaviorist ideas that are traditionally rampant in our schools to utilizing this shift in mindset.
Well, I think the first thought that came to mind is we want, I think all of us, because we're human, we want there to be a consequence. We want there to be something that happens after there's a misbehavior or a problem. And as long as we hold on to that as a want or a need, it almost feels like we're not going to be able to really evolve, because we always want to know, like, what do we do when so and so, or how do we teach him a lesson, or we can't let him get away with that, or what would the other kids think if we don't give a consequence to their classmate. And really, it's not so important what happens after. The only thing that's important is that we can build trust again, we can repair a relationship, we can help the kid, feel okay and get back to what they need to do. But we want there to be some kind of consequence, or something
Shame.
that happens. Shame is a big
We
part
want
of this.
children to feel shame.
Yeah.
We say we because I am an educator. That is not what I hope for kids to feel.
Right.
But it's so grounded in that
It is.
need for kids to feel bad about it.
Right, because we don't feel okay unless they feel bad.
It's true.
Yeah, it's really convoluted, right? When you talk about things like this, I mean, in my ears, it just sounds twisted.
You're right.
But it's what happens all the time. Even when I was an intern, my first day of school, so I was, again, in my 20s, a social work intern at a public school, I said to kind of the supervisor, social worker, I said, does this happen in every school? Are the kids screamed out all the time? Because I don't think if I have kids, I want them to go to school if that's how it is. And this was just like a lovely, normal school, because we're always being yelled at. Why would that be okay? Why would it be okay?
Oh, I'm going to be honest, even to get yelled at now as an adult is hard. And I'm going to be honest, as a principal, I get yelled at all the time by other adults. And it still is like, oh man. And it's something that is used often. And I'm going to be very transparent and honest. I sometimes yell at my child and I'm like, why did I do that?
Well, yeah.
Then I got to do what I've done many times before, apologize and say,
Right.
listen, I didn't handle that correctly. And I think that's a key, that we're all human. And there are those times as educators in a trauma-informed, focused principle that I make mistakes. We're not
Right.
talking about those times. We're talking about the operating system on how we address kids is to put them in the place, tell them what to do. You are to be seen, not heard. That philosophy that stuck around culturally for a long time for many of us,
Right.
it's shifting. So what do we do to shift? So if there's educators like, okay, yeah, that's what I experienced, or that's what I've been told, but what do I do then?
Well, one of the things, so is this prevention part, right? It's figuring out what each child needs and thinking about that to start with. And I know some educators, because I do a lot of training too, they feel that it takes a lot of time. But as you and I know, Matthew, it doesn't take more time than the time it takes on the back end. It's just on the front end, the prevention time. It saves so much time down the road. So really looking at the situation, figuring it out, working on prevention, what each child needs, and then figuring out how to support them. But I think with the understanding that we're not going to be 100% successful. And it doesn't mean there has to be a punishment or consequence. It's saying, to the child, hey, that didn't work, right? For either of us. So let's put our brains together and let's see if for next time we can have a plan. Like, it doesn't have to be like a big deal.
No. And I think I call this seed planting, not fruit bearing all the time. Sometimes we're just planting seeds, right? And here's another point that I always like when we're talking about this is, what if, as a school administrator, I treated the teachers the exact same way they're asking me to treat the kids? Right. And it's true. And I'm going to go back to the whole clip chart idea that we publicly shame kids and that's going to change the behavior.
Horrible.
I said to my staff very early on, like, we're not using those anymore. And I was kind of like, but if you do want to, then I'll just use it in a faculty meeting. So if you pull your phone out, I'm just going to say, hey, Miss So-and-so, just go clip down. It's fine. Just go clip down. And the thing is, we can leave. Like, adults can leave. Yeah. Kids can't. And matter of fact, some kids do try to leave. Right. And then it's like, well, why is the kid running? Right. Well, I mean, what would happen if you were in a space that all the time you were constantly being, I might run as well, but I think I want to go back to what you said about being proactive and not reactive. And I know that we had a listener that resonated to, because this work is proactive driven. It's not reactive in response.
Right. But somehow we'd much rather yell at a kid 100 times for the same thing than solve the problem proactively. It's just so confusing to me. But I think that's a big thing that needs to change. I also think, and I'm sure your school is an exception, and I do want to visit it one day, but I think creating a culture of support in the classroom, because I know that so many kids I've known have been picked on by their peers because the other kids got the message that that's okay from the teacher.
Yes.
Subtle ways, just that annoyance.
Yep. It's true. It's true. And here's the thing, until we have candid conversations of some of the practices that are used are traumatizing our children. Yeah. It's traumatizing. Yes. Schools can, and I'll be honest and tell you, early in my career, I can honestly say what we were doing to kids is not what we should have been doing for kids. And my paradigm shift had to happen at that first year of me being school administrator and going, like you said earlier, I just had that feeling like it just doesn't feel right. Like something doesn't feel right. And then I was presented with the information about the neuroscience and physiological
Mhm.
response to trauma, and I was like, this is the kids that we're trying to support, and this is not working. I mean,
Right.
that's the paradigm shift that we have to get all educators to take on. Like, this isn't personal. They're not, most of the time they're not choosing to make us miserable.
Almost never, really.
Exactly.
Yeah. I don't know any, I could say never. I mean, unless, well, for a lot of complicated reasons. That's the only way they think they can get our attention.
It's
But
true.
right, as long as we think people need a consequence, like that person, we're gonna be in trouble because it's not intentional. It's
Right.
not volitional. And when we give those messages to kids, I can imagine how confusing that is because they know it wasn't on purpose,
Right.
but they're being treated like it was.
Right.
So how then do they trust their own thoughts and feelings?
They
Because we're
don't.
telling them that it's wrong. So what are they learning? It's just,
They're learning that something is wrong with them.
yes, right.
And that's not the case, right? And I think I've been through that as a kid. I thought something was wrong with me. It's why I didn't become an educator till I was 29, because it took me meeting my wife to realize I wasn't meeting my own potential and that I had been lied to by many people, that I was trouble, I was not able to do. And I think that's a lot of kids' experience. It's not every kid's
Right.
experience,
Yeah.
right? There's kids
Yeah.
that make it through school, they're fine. I'm not the kid that's going to sit there and be quiet. I'm probably going to ask you annoying questions. I'm probably going to want to know why. If I'm bored, I will be active. And it's a, I guess it just comes from internally. And I think there's a great comment here too, is the
Yeah.
child's not giving you a hard time. They're having a hard time.
Abs-
That's where it takes it from it being personal
right.
to being understanding that kids might be in a different space.
Right. And when we look at it differently, like if kind of like in the PDA world, we talk about that if you imagine that kids having a panic attack instead of a behavioral episode, with a panic attack, you'd feel empathetic, you'd go to help them, you might talk quieter or give them space or bring them a drink or a blanket and comfort them, right? But when we look at things as behavioral, we go to punishment and touching them and getting in their space and repeating instruction over and over and threatening consequences or telling them the rules and all these things that are just going to escalate them. So I think in what schools can do differently also, besides that culture and the proactive and that empathy, is is looking at comfort and care when kids are struggling and really treating them as we'd want to be treated if we were struggling, and to not think it's intentional but think that the child is having a hard time.
So, Diane, what do you tell schools when they say, okay, that sounds good, but what about the other kids? So, this child is escalated every day. This child is tearing up classrooms every day. What about the other kids? Because that's something that I hear often, and I understand the perspective. But what do you say to
Right.
schools or educators when that is a response or
Right.
question?
So I have a lot of thoughts, and it's often comes um, up in talking to schools. So one thing, which is I'm going to start with it because it's a little different than your question, but I want to answer your question because it's so important. One thought I always have is I think we don't give kids enough credit, the other kids. I worked in one school that there was a girl who had a lot of needs and a seizure disorder that could not be controlled, and all the kids knew her, and she wore a old fashioned helmet, and if she didn't eat, her seizures got worse, and the main thing she would eat would be McDonald's french fries. So the mother wanted to bring McDonald's French fries to her at her lunch period. And the principal wouldn't allow it because what about the other kids? They can't have McDonald's French fries. And I said, I am happy to talk to every other student in the school. I have confidence when I say to them, Susie, she only will eat French fries. Can you guys handle her eating McDonald's French fries every day at lunch? I have full confidence that 100% would have been fine with it. And I think when we let them in and we talk about like supporting each other and really build community, kids kids can get it. And they can be part of the solution because kids love to be asked to help and treated like they know something. I also think we want to respect privacy. And part of the low arousal approach in crisis intervention, which I like, is you remove the other kids from a room. If one kid, and schools hate when I write that in my behavior assessments. We can't move, kids, but it's so much easier really to move 20 regulated kids than one non-regulated, dysregulated kid. Kids leave the room all the time. They go to the library. They can go on a walk and give the child time to kind of regain composure to a place that they maybe could go to an office or a supportive room. It also, I think, gives assurance to the other kids that if they ever have a really hard time, their privacy is going to be respected and their needs are going to be met. And it's all, I think, how you talk about it, how you approach it. If it's like done in this punitive way, if the kids are told, oh gosh, we have to leave because, so-and-so's at it again, it's not going to go well. But if you say, hey, we're in this together, when one person has a hard time, we all have to help, kids will rise to the occasion.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because we had, I'm an active principal, so we had a principals meeting and they brought in active high school students and they set them at our table and we just got to have conversations. And I unapologetically took over the whole conversation because I was ready to dig in. And I was like, okay, so if a kid struggles, with something at your school behaviorally, they're getting fights,
Right.
Do you feel it's effective to suspend them? And the kids at the table were unanimous. No, that doesn't help. Like if they're fighting, there's a reason they're fighting. And then let's have a conversation to figure out why they continue to like. The kids were processing this in ways I'm like, they get it. Like,
right.
And I think especially now, the way I grew up is not the way my son is growing up. The world my son lives in is not the world I lived in. Yeah. My son knows about world events that when I was in school, I had no clue they were even occurring. Right. I think about the genocide in Rwanda. I was a junior in high school and didn't know a thing about it. Knew nothing. My son is 10. He's in 5th grade. He doesn't know everything, but we do have open conversations with things going on in the world. And it's like the kids now are not the kids that we were, and they are coming with a different mindset, which I think is not a bad thing.
No.
But you're right. Kids do see the need for empathy and understanding, and they must be having a really hard time. You are right. Thank you for noticing that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So what do you see the next steps in this work? Where do you see this going from you, from a social worker standpoint, and from your, is it PDA you said? I wasn't familiar with that, but I did look some up. What do you see the next steps being for schools, not just in those little pieces, but I'm talking about big shifts?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I'm hoping that like Mona's work and the brain science is going to make a difference, even though, the 90s, right? That was the decade of the brain, but it can take 30 years before things reach schools. I'm hoping that will help. I'm also a little hopeful that out of, the horribleness of COVID can be maybe more awareness and understanding about mental health and
Yes.
emotions
Yes.
and trauma. And then maybe we can take a pause and look at how to make our schools meet the emotional needs of our kids. I've never had a client get fired from a job because of academic problems, always
Right.
for social and emotional needs. That, I don't know, I always keep thinking that, is there a way to bring back kindness, you know?
Right. Right.
The Because the brain science is great and I love it, but even without it, there's, schools and families and communities all over the world that don't know brain science, but they're
Right.
just loving and kind.
Yes.
So I think we need to somehow figure that out too. And one thing that I think gets in the way at schools is that teachers feel embarrassed if their colleagues don't see them control their classroom and control
Right.
their students.
Yes.
And what if the principal walks in? What if the teacher in the next room judges me? I work with lots of paraprofessionals who do way too much because they don't want the teacher to think that they're neglecting their duties. So
Mhm.
they're kind of hovering over a kid who doesn't want to be
Hovered over.
hovered over,
Yeah.
and, but they're worried they're going to be judged by the
Sure.
teacher.
Interesting.
So I think we need to have these conversations.
Right.
We need to trust each other. We need to look at our schools as communities and include parents
Right.
in that community, because they like the us and them stuff.
Yeah.
It's just so harmful to everybody, especially
Absolutely.
kids.
And here's something, and I don't know how up to date you are on this, but I just recently learned that in the state of Michigan, they are now banning some terminology. SEL is one of them. They're trying to say you can no longer use. I've also learned that inclusivity of education, you're not allowed to talk about anymore. Marginalized entities can't talk about. Multiculturalism, microaggressions, all of these things that are talked about in our work. And I'm going to be honest, I'm in Tennessee. We have passed some of the most absurd laws over the
Yeah.
last year that has blown my mind. One of them is, I don't even know the name of the bill that the law that passed, but if a student misbehaves in the class, the teacher can request to have them booted out of the classroom. And it has to go to the principal if there's an appeal process, so teachers can get rid of kids based off of what's going on. That's just one of the many. Now that I see this happening in Michigan and this resurgence of antisocial and emotional learning, anti-equitable conversations, like this has become the new thing that a lot of legislators are getting a hold of. And I can only imagine that Tennessee is going to be right up there in the front. And so I want listeners and those that are involved in this work to know that now there is going to be a fight against everything Diane and I just said, everything that we're talking about, everything against kids that are not neurotypical, right? We don't want to talk about that, and now it's becoming a political stance. And so we're taking human rights, we're taking humanizing education, and now I can see this becoming a political divide. Have you seen this or heard about this? Because I'm digging into it deeply, and it is disturbing.
That is so terrifying. And I think it comes down to a lot of what we've seen in the last years is people are so terrified of change
Wow, you're right.
and so threatened by change. And
Hmm.
we're going to have to fight harder. We
And
have to win this.
and I think that's a great segue to this last question. What do you want education or educators to know right now? What do you want the teachers to hear from you right now?
All right. It's a great question. But can I say one thing first? I don't know
Absolutely.
why we can't get to college students who are majoring in education more. So we don't have to help teachers unlearn habits.
Yes.
Why can't we get them to learn in the first place? I also, and I'm not a teacher, but I know a lot of teachers. I, to me, the model of, because I remember one of my kids majored in education. Like to go through college and then you're 21 and to be put alone in a classroom and be expected to meet all the needs after one student teaching gig, it just the whole setup doesn't make sense to me. And I once heard a person who owned a hair salon describe everything like someone would have to do before they could cut someone's hair.
Right.
All these supervised
Right.
kind of things. And that's like to cut someone's hair. We're talking
Right.
like to you know, form the happiness
Right.
and emotional well-being, because that's really what teachers have all that power, right?
Yes.
Of our children.
Mm.
And we just put these kids, these young people in these situations and where they're afraid of being judged by their more experienced colleagues and the administrators. And they're just trying to get through the day and they
Mhm.
don't get enough support. I feel, I mean, that's how the system's always been, but I worry about that just as something workable. I think there's been talk about different mentoring plans and all that, but I don't know what's really worked.
Right. And I think that's valid. And as a teacher, I remember my first year, and I was very blessed to co-teach with a veteran teacher
Oh,
because I
okay.
started while I was student teaching.
Uh,
And so I think that is what gave me a foot forward to be able to learn from a master of the craft. We had different teaching styles, but she was amazing. And she saw me for my strengths as a new teacher, and I validated and saw her for hers as a veteran teacher. And I agree with that. And I think that we have to look at things completely different in teacher prep programs.
yeah.
As a school, I consider the school that I lead a training school.
Yeah.
And so we partner with 3 local universities,
Oh,
including
oh,
Vanderbilt University. Matter of fact, that's our largest partner. We
oh,
house every teacher that has the experience, the ability, and the willpower to mentor. We partner a student teacher with them every single year because I
oh,
feel like that's our way of continuing this, building this
yeah.
work, because you're right. And I think giving teachers a year of student teaching, and let's be honest, some of them don't even do a full year, we're
Yeah.
setting our teachers up for failure. And then we look back and go, wonder why there's a teacher shortage. That's just one of the
Right.
laundry list of reasons why teachers are not staying in this profession. Just one. There's I
Yeah.
could list them all.
I agree.
And I think you're right. I think we have to look at this. We have to look at residencies for longer periods of time and partnerships and
Right.
mentoring. And I agree with that 100%. So that leads me to this last question
Okay.
again.
Yeah.
What
And
do you want teachers to know?
I guess my first thought is that they don't have to have all the answers. They don't have to intervene. It's so much better to do nothing if you're not sure then act. I think just in my work with kids, some of the most powerful relationships have come when I've said to a child, like, I'm just not sure, but like, I'm not sure how to help you. I'm not sure what we should do now, but we're gonna figure it out together. We'll come up with something like together.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I think if teachers can just focus on the relationship
Mm-hmm.
and that building trust,
Mm-hmm.
they don't have to worry about having, the classroom behavioral systems. They can just focus on the relationship and building a classroom community, because kids can only learn if they feel safe.
Absolutely. And I would say that's not brain science, but it actually is.
It
It
is.
actually is brain science.
It is
So,
brain science. Now we can prove it. We can prove
yeah,
kind of, what some people knew all along.
exactly. Exactly. So, Diane, if people want to learn more about you and your work, where can they find you?
I have a few different websites. I'm in the midst of updating my website because I am so bad. I do no social media. I have like a really outdated website, but it's kind of just DianeGouldTherapy.com.
Excellent.
So
Excellent.
that's a
I'm
good
impressed. No social media. I probably need more of that in my life,
one too.
nonetheless. So,
Every once in a while, I think I might be missing out, and then I hear somebody's, dinner, vacation, something, and
well, I'm very impressed. And speaking of social media, I am on social media. So if you do want to find me on Twitter or Instagram, I am Principal List, which means the most principal. I don't know. I just made that up many years ago.
You are.
And then if you want to follow me on Facebook or LinkedIn, there's so many places that you can find the Trauma Informed Educators Network as a page, the Trauma Informed Educators Network group, the Trauma Informed Educators Network podcast, and Paradigm Shift Education. You can find those anywhere. If you are a listener of this podcast, I would love you to tell me how we do. If you want to hear something, give it a review on whatever platform you do. Give it a review on social media, on Facebook. Tell me, message me, hey, I've got a good guest, or hey, I want to be a guest. That's how I find guests, is by people reaching out and people telling me you need to talk to this person. And so if you like this podcast, share it, tell somebody about it, share a segment with somebody, use it in a training if you so desire to do, but please get the message out that this is a paradigm shift that we are all working towards. And remember the hashtag Disruptors Unite, because that's what it's about. All of us who are trying to say we just need to do it differently and start progressing the work forward. So thank you all who are on here live. And if you are listening as on the podcast, thank you for listening. And as always, if you need to, please wear a mask and wash your hands. All right, we're still live here on the live stream. So thank you all for listening. Thank you for those who commented, Guy and Chrissy and Johnny and David and all of those that were here. Thank you. We will not be back next Thursday because it is my wife's birthday, but I will be back on the 23rd to speak to someone in policy and an advocate for policy change. And I would love to get people on that call about what we can do on the big scale of getting policies changed around this work. Diane, thank you so much. Thank you for those of you who came to listen and commented. We really do appreciate your participation. And I will see you all on the 23rd. Diane, if you could stay on just a minute. Thank you all very much, and I will see you then.